Hello, I'm Shankar.
And I'm Nikhil. This is Chai Across Generations. This is episode 22, Immigration, Second Generation Guilt and Growth.
We kicked off our series on immigration last week with a discussion on what immigration is and some of my stories of immigrating to the US as a graduate student. It was an emotional and meaningful episode for me. How was it for you, Nikhil?
Yes, it was really special to hear your story, Shankar, as someone whose parents could very much relate to your story. We also heard from some of our listeners, especially those in your generation, that it really resonated with them too. I think you captured how transformative and emotional the first generation experience can be. If you haven't listened to it, no matter what generation you're in, I'd highly recommend checking it out. It's the previous episode, episode 21. And even if you haven't heard it yet, you can also just jump into this conversation since it covers different topics related to immigration. So Shankar, what's on tap for today?
Thanks so much, Nikhil. On today's episode, we continue the discussion on immigration, and this time we focus more on the second generation. We cover a lot of ground, including how second generation immigrants learn to make sense of their identity from guilt to growth, what first generation parents dream of for their children, and how we can all learn to appreciate immigrant stories of all flavors without getting caught up in comparative suffering.
I can't wait to dive in. We'll come back at the end to wrap things up. Here we go. I want to maybe fight against this idea, this notion, especially as we get more and more generations down the line. When people's eyes glaze over, people roll their eyes at like, oh, sure, another uncle or auntie who's telling me their immigration story or whatever, right? Like, I think we have to really try to hold on to some appreciation for it and to realize that maybe every story is unique, even if the contours of the story or like the circumstances under which people immigrated might be similar. We can't lose that just because some of these stories share the same features.
That's a profoundly perceptive statement. I am so gladdened and impressed at how you understand that, Nikhil. That's just fantastic. The level of empathy you show there, because it is a transformative life experience. Right. I think that's exactly what you're putting your finger at. Every immigrant's story is a transformative. It's a big part of their life, and we can try to deny it. We can try to rose color it, whitewash it, maybe. But, there's ups and downs like anything else in life. And I tried to surface both, I think, in my recounting of the narrative. One other thing that bothered me and also spoke to me was, I think there's this guy, I don't know his exact name, but Chaudhry. And when I was in New Jersey at Rutgers, I was teaching, and I remember reading an article by him called, the title of which was, "We Want Your Labor and Not Your Lives." And this is a peculiar part of immigration, which is the home country, the country to which people are immigrating, in our case, the United States, sees it as a transactional labor interaction. So you have skills, we need your skills, we'll bring you here, and we'll pay you for it. Okay? What is lost in this is that people don't move just for money and trading their skills.
Right.
They have families. So people don't, the feeling, what Chaudhry was trying to surface is that they're very happy if you can come in and improve the economy. But if you're going to come with like 3 aunts and 4 uncles and 3 of your, both sides, just your parents even, right? And they may not be able to adapt in the same ways that the working segment of the immigrant population does. That's seen as unpleasant. It's a burden. Now you got all these people of different colors with cooking different foods with different smells and different clothes walking all over the place.
Right.
And that's somehow not okay. But that's wrong. I mean, immigration is a package deal. Some of that culture is going to come with it. And I think that's a very myopic view of immigration that is still seen in the debates in Congress. It's like, what economic benefit can I get from these people coming here, right?
Mm.
Well, I think you better prepare yourself for a lot more than that,
Yeah, absolutely.
right?
Yeah, there's this notion of being seen and appreciated
Right.
in what you're saying, right?
Right.
And speaking of immigration stories, when there's a story my family tells when we immigrated over that I heard secondhand from my parents, but we were in Ireland for a year, right? So the age of 2, I immigrated to Ireland with my parents. We were ready to stay there for as long as we needed to before we came to the U.S., with the goal to ultimately settle in the U.S. About 6 months into that experience, my mom, my dad, and I were on a ferry between Ireland and the UK, and between Ireland and England. And I was a 2-year-old boy hanging out on my mom's shoulder, right? And as my parents tell the story, a man came up to me, didn't say a single word to us, handed me an American flag, and walked away. Now, my parents, this was an amazing, inspiring, joyful moment because they didn't know if they were going to make it,
Right.
right? And so I'm this little kid waving around this American flag, and this to this day is part of my family lore.
Right.
And contrasting it to the story you just told, I think part of what was powerful about it is that the family was seen.
Right.
Yeah, the story is highlighting some of what I mentioned earlier about how amazing and inspirational and beautiful, like that's a scene out of a movie, right? How beautiful it is, but also how alienating it can be, if those things are not acknowledged, to your point.
Right, right. So just to see both sides of the picture is what I'm trying to say. I think you're so right.
Right,
A
right.
lot of the immigration stories tend to glamorize it so much, right?
Yeah.
And I guess it kind of serves two purposes, right? It serves the purpose of the domestic audience, um, to glamorize the welcoming, and I think a lot of immigrant families also want to forget some of that stuff. You can see it
Right.
in so many different ways. So, for instance, my generation is a lot less comfortable with embracing our identity, say South Asian or Indian identity, more publicly than your generation.
Yeah, great point.
And I actually
Fantastic point.
congratulate you guys for that because it's fantastic. You own it. You'll flaunt
Yeah.
it, and.
Yeah. So there's Hassan Minhaj is a South
Right.
Asian comic, and his first special is called Homecoming King on Netflix. It's a great special. It talks a lot about the immigrant experience,
Right.
and he has a really beautiful line in there where he talks about for his parents when they experienced racism, their reaction was kind of, "This is just what happens,"
Right.
and he coins this idea of an American dream tax.
Right.
Right? This, like, if you're a first generation immigrant, you come here, you put in all that time and energy and sweat and tears, you come here and you realize you're going to get some of this pushback
Right.
or backlash.
Right.
And it's just what it is.
Right.
Whatever. This is the tax I pay. This is part of the tax I pay.
Right.
Whereas future generations, we didn't have the blood, sweat, and tears, so we're like, wait a minute, I'm an American,
Right.
right? We're more likely to maybe embrace our identity, to push back if we see some of those cases. And not to say that we always do, right? Like,
Right.
discrimination, racism are very difficult things, and there are many responses you can take to that, including just stepping away. It's not like we are always standing up and fighting.
Right.
But I thought that was a really interesting distinction between first generation and second generation.
Yeah, it reminded me of this phrase from, I think, one of a TV show about like Black history, where it says, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Right.
Right.
So, in some sense, not exactly the same sense, of course. Like your generation, like, hey, we're here. We didn't choose to come
Yeah.
here even. We're here already.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah. There's this business
Yeah.
of forgetting. I wanted to surface two more points that came to my mind. One is that peculiar thing that once people become citizens, they forget the trials of immigration. And I'm not saying everyone does, but I think it's important. So part of why had a lot of energy to do this is I want people to remember that, look, it wasn't easy, and it's not easy for those who are going through it right now. And even though you may be a citizen, when when you go to the voting booth, or when you see something, a story on NPR or a podcast, open your heart a little bit, and remember that it wasn't easy for you. It's not easy for others who are going through it right now, and that there really has to be a push to have real, meaningful solutions to some of the issues at stake right now, which are really being, stuck in gridlock. I know that a lot of it is beyond us, but I think it's important to keep that front and center. And it also makes me very peculiar. It fills me with very a sense of something I can't understand is those who immigrate and also want to shut the door behind them. I'm not saying it's a black and white case. There are, it's a nuanced question who should immigrate, and we may come back to that later in the podcast. But I'm sometimes puzzled by what are the motivations there, because I would think that if you've been through that process, you may at least have a more nuanced understanding of it, and if not broadly support. I'm not saying open borders or whatever, but you may have a more informed perspective and sympathetic perspective of people who are trying to do this legally.
Right.
And so that's again something which I would say, let's not forget. And I think that resonates with what you were saying. It's a transformative experience.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and to your point, I think there's a lesson here around just seeking out stories and experiences, even within the immigrant population, that are different than our own.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, as an example, to complete the story, after I waved my flag as a kid and we came to the U.S., my parents were naturalized as American citizens, later, something like 10 to 13 years later, right? But because they became American citizens and I was still a minor, I became an American citizen at the same time. So I remember being there when they went through they got done with their test, they got their citizenship, and I got mine too as a minor. That's a little bit different than my sister's experience, who was born in America, right? And people growing up here, but I guess I wanted to maybe add that flavor in there of there's the naturalized citizen as well,
right?
Which is the experience I had, and I'll be honest with you, I haven't thought about that in a long time,
right?
Even though it's an integral part of my story,
right?
Until we were thinking of doing this episode.
Yeah, I was just joking with you that you can't run for president, but your sister could.
I know. I mean, what can I say? Right? Maybe we can start a petition and see if we can lift that requirement.
I'll sign it, Nikhil.
Would you vote for me?
I would vote for you. You have my vote right there.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of steps between here and there.
Yeah, but I'm glad you brought this point up because I think it segues very nicely into our discussion about immigration beyond just being South Asian and Indian. The first thing I want to say here is, look, my personal story is so specific, and it's probably going to sound to many like coming from a position of great privilege at some level, which I'm conscious of, compared to many other immigration stories, which could be significantly less privileged, less power, far more harrowing tales, I'm sure, are there. And so I just want to respect that. I want to say that, look, I'm aware of this. I'm not trying to make this, my great, great trial or something like that. Place it in perspective, place it in context. There's immigration from different parts of the world at different levels of professional qualification. There's asylum. There's, people who find themselves like Brian De Los Santos, in a situation which was probably not his making in some sense, right?
Right.
So, yeah, I think that segues nicely into immigration beyond South Asian or Indian and things like that. Yeah.
Right. And I did want to say, too, that tied up in the notion of immigration is this idea of comparative suffering. Right? And I don't think it's anyone's intention, but it's easy to focus on stories of immigration as, oh, who had it harder,
Right.
who had it worse. And it's important to acknowledge all of those,
Right.
not to diminish
Right.
anyone's, but sometimes I wish we can take each story as its own.
Mm-hmm.
Your story, incredibly powerful, incredibly important. I'm glad you shared that here.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you can appreciate that in its triumph and its sadness and its emotion,
Mm-hmm.
irrespective of what other stories are out there, right? To acknowledge there are other stories out there, but not to say, okay, where is that on the scale of comparative pain of immigration stories, right?
You're so wise, Nikhil. I'm glad I have you on the podcast. That's bang on. You're right. You're right. And it's actually a place where I tripped up and you caught me. So thanks.
No, right. It's difficult. It's very easy to do. I mean, I'm glad you acknowledge it. It's definitely good to acknowledge there are better and worse, quote unquote, stories if you think about it in terms of
Right.
the pain involved or how harrowing it was.
Right.
But I just hope, I think I'm saying it kind of as an observer,
Yeah.
for someone who doesn't have a firsthand experience,
Right.
to say, you know, regardless, like,
Yes.
we don't need the most
Yes.
dramatic, harrowing story in order to care.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Your story is just as valuable and just as interesting as someone else's, and each one we have to think of as its own. I'm still working to do that myself. Let me just say that too. But that's what I want to try to keep in mind.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Yeah. That's really special. It just makes me feel seen and heard and acknowledged and uniquely valuable in some sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, you are. So there you go. Maybe you can be my running mate for president one day.
It's a good one. Surely, Nikhil. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, today a podcast, tomorrow president. Like, what's stopping us?
Right. Exactly. Just the law, but nothing else. I did want to ask, so as we think about immigration beyond South Asian and Indian community, well, you and I have so far talked about kind of the first generation experience, the second generation experience separately. I kind of want to start to link these together.
Mm-hmm.
As a first generation immigrant, right, coming into this country, knowing you'll be raising kids here, what do we expect of our children, and what do we expect for our children?
What do we expect of our children? My feeling has always been that they will sort of stand on our shoulders and reach higher than us.
Hmm.
And I've left it particularly vague what I mean by reach higher, because that's how you define it, right?
Right.
Perhaps close to my heart is a fairer society, a more humane society, where we treat everyone in this country in a better way, right? For me, that's aspirational. Even though I'll say that, as I said, I was very idealistic. I was moved by all these high-minded principles, and then I, brushed up against reality, which was a little different. But I've not still lost that aspirational ideal, in some sense. And it's still a pole star. It's still a North Star. I think there are some really beautiful things articulated in the American experience itself, and the formation of America itself, which are moving. And as they are in the formation of any nation at some level, any democratic
Right.
institution has its inspiring moments, right?
Right.
And so us having entered that experiment as first generation immigrants, I would personally love to see our second generation listen and acknowledge the trials and sacrifices we made, so that you may fashion a more just, a more humane, and a more happy and prosperous society, right?
Yeah.
And of course, that starts with you being all of those, right, to begin with. But then it extends, right? It's you, then your family, then your community, and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're hitting on a really important point, because there is this, I guess I've been mentioning a form of this throughout the conversation, right? This lack of appreciation potentially, right? From a second generation to a first generation. You mentioned wanting to be appreciated, seen in that story. What are ways that people can do that? And maybe we take second generation to first generation, right? Kids and their parents. Maybe I don't know if you have any personal anecdotes as well with you and Shivani, or just in general, right? But what would make you feel seen and appreciated in your immigrant story from the next generation?
I think actually just they're asking their the first generation parents or whoever went through that, um, just listening to their story first of all, like listen to the
Mm-hmm.
entire to the whole thing, and sometimes it takes time for people to open up and talk about everything. You may not get it on the first iteration. I tend to be, I would say, very transparent and articulate, and I don't hold anything back. But not everyone's like that. Sometimes you
Mm-hmm.
have to sit at their knee and ask many times, like, "Oh, how was it when you came over, and what did you go through?" And you know, um, assuming somehow that, well, they got here and like it's my problems, and they must have had it easy, or whatever, however they had it, I don't care. That's hard. That's
Right.
always hard
Yeah.
for a first generation immigrant to hear. um, but at the same time, I think on the flip side we also have to appreciate that the thinking and perception of second generation is going to be different from ours. That is, I'm now speaking to my you know to my cohort. um,
Right.
so have the patience to understand that they have grown up in a different environment, different society. They own their identity differently. Their identity is itself somewhat different from ours, shaped differently. And yeah, so I think holding that mutual respect is, again, very, very central and essential to our whole podcast idea, conversation across
Yeah.
generations, right? So having, I think, starting those conversations, having those discussions, which often gets glossed over, right? I mean, how many kids sit down and ask their parents, they'll tell me about your immigration story. It
Yeah.
actually doesn't happen sometimes.
Yeah, and maybe to shed some light there, I think part of it is
Mm-hmm.
expectations of the
Oh,
second generation,
right,
right?
right.
So the other question I was going to pose was like, how do we expect our children to grow up in a different culture,
Mm.
right? And I think for me, I'll speak just personally. I think my parents expected certain
Mm-hmm.
things to stay the same,
Mm.
and they changed, right? When you move
Mm-hmm.
to a different country and you raise your kids in a different country, like you said, they grow up in a different environment.
Right,
They are going to be different.
right.
You hope some of the same traditions and values stay alive, and hopefully they will. But some of those will even
Yeah.
change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is a sense of being somewhat set upon where, if you're thinking, okay, well, I'm grateful that my parents moved here, but now I feel like I'm not measuring up to their
Yeah.
yardstick, which is impossible in my view, right? In
Right.
this society. This is how I felt growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I don't necessarily have the grace in that moment to ask,
Yeah.
about their story. So I think that is the personal battle. There's a guilt, I guess, associated being second generation
Right.
when you feel like you don't measure up to something your family expects or your society expects.
That's a very good point. And I think the first thing that we have to do from our side is to acknowledge what a huge transition this is, right?
Mm.
And it's not just a question of, as I said, the social fabric changing, travel. We talked about it over the generations. Um, but you guys are growing up in a vastly different environment. Um, if you look around you, um, and you think of a person growing up in India, and you ask yourself, what is the majority, skin color, sports, whatever, skills, faith, um, anything, right? I don't know how many South Asian or Indian parents pause to think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think to me, growing up, at least in the 90s here in America, and my cohort of Indian kids at that time,
Right,
it was absolutely not considered from a parental perspective, right? As
right,
much, or a societal perspective. And it led to some feelings of
yeah,
loneliness, of feeling like, wait, these things are expected of me when everyone in my school thinks differently,
yeah,
dresses differently.
yeah,
Like, we have different views on family, on friends, on
right,
TV privileges. Like, I could go down the list,
yeah.
right? Everything is different, and I wonder if that's different for parents immigrating today or parents immigrating in the last 10 or 20 years.
Hmm. It's a good question. I think it's much easier for us who grew up in a sort of, and I say here, homogeneous in the sense of, you're the majority, everyone around you is
Right.
your color, or most people are, right? So when you're in that majority, um, society supports what your family supports in some sense to a large
Yeah.
extent.
Right.
For you guys, uh, your family's aspirations may not be at all supported by your societal norms,
Hmm.
and that creates conflict,
Right.
right? So, um, what I found very useful is to think back to my heritage and my upbringing and everything and ask what is the essential part that endures,
Hmm.
what has to change, and what will endure.
Mm-hmm.
And if you constantly distill that and you focus only on what you know must endure, then in a remarkable way, a lot of even what might change actually um, stays the same. So
Hmm.
it's kind of counterintuitive. When you try to grab onto a lot, then it eludes you. But if you grab onto just the most important stuff, the rest kind of comes along with it.
Yeah. That's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good point. And I'm glad you said that. It ties to something I was going to share.
Mm-hmm.
Um, from a theoretical perspective,
Oh,
with my professorial hat on
I love it.
for a second. Uh, it's the idea of acculturation,
Ah, yes. Uh-huh.
right? Acculturation is just how do you get used to a second culture being from your home culture. And I've been doing a lot of research on this again for my coaching paper that you and I are working on outside of the podcast. But there's kind of four strategies or four ways based on this paper I read by this guy John W. Barry in 1997. Um, if you think about it as a 2x2 matrix, you have kind of how do you relate to your own culture on one axis and how do you relate to the other culture, the second culture, on the other axis.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say yes to your culture and yes to the other culture, that is integration, right? You're holding on to core pieces of your culture,
Right.
but you're also engaging with the other culture and integrating practices, ways of thinking and living from them.
Right.
The second strategy is assimilation, which is where you say no to your home culture, but yes to the culture you've moved into.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is, some people call it going native, but that's just kind of saying, in our context, I guess, forget about my South Asian identity.
Right.
I'm an American now,
Right.
right? And shipping off those rituals or traditions. The third strategy is separation,
Mm-hmm.
which is saying yes to your culture but no to
Mm-hmm.
the other culture.
Mm-hmm.
Saying I'm just going to be this way. I'm Indian or South Asian.
Right.
I'm not American. I reject all of these ideals.
Right.
And the last one is marginalization,
Mm-hmm.
which is you say no to your own culture and no to the other culture.
Right.
For this condition to exist, it probably involves some factors around discrimination, coming into a country or mistreatment. So those are the four: integration, assimilation, separation, marginalization. Integration, based on the research, is the healthiest, best kind of way to acculturate into a different culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it ties to what you were saying in terms of holding on to some of your core values,
Mm-hmm.
right, from your home culture, but then integrating new ways of thinking in life.
Yeah, it reminds you of the metaphor I talked to David Tracy in that podcast about being the swan that can separate milk from water. So can you take the best from every experience?
Right.
So can you be the swan in terms of your Indian heritage, and can you be a swan in terms of your American experience?
Yeah.
If you can take the best from both, then you have assimilation. I think of the
Right.
other one. No, sorry, you have integration. My apologies.
Right.
Assimilation, I think of is like the phrase, "When you're in Rome, do as the Romans do."
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And what was the other one you had? Oh, the other one that I think of, the usual little name of the country, sectors
Yeah.
in every big metropolis that you see, right?
Little India,
Right.
Little Tokyo.
Yeah.
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 Right. Right.
So that's typically what happens, I think, there very often. And then, of course, the last one is really an outsider syndrome. It's like the
Right.
marginalization. You feel you don't.
Right.
It's a hard and difficult and lonely place to be. But yeah, it does happen. So that wraps up the second part of our discussion on immigration. What are you taking away from the conversation, Nikhil?
I liked our discussion on how important it is to appreciate all immigrant stories and each generation's unique relationship to the immigrant story, and how we don't need the most dramatic, harrowing stories to care about them. It's not about comparative suffering, right? That feels like the heartbeat of this entire series to me. And it also felt good to give voice to the pressure of being second generation and the confusion that comes with navigating two different worlds. It's not easy, but I'm optimistic that we can learn to integrate the two sides of ourselves to create a really beautiful and rich life that's meaningful and valuable in its own unique way.
I love how you can reframe such an emotionally difficult experience into a positive, forward looking story, Nikhil. Truly, like the philosopher's stone, your attitude can lead to gold transmute.
Thanks, Shankar. If only I could transmute lead to gold, this would be a very different type of podcast. But hopefully, this attitude can add a little bit more gold to my days and to my interactions with others. What are you taking away from the conversation, Shankar?
I feel very similarly, Nikhil. It gives me a sense of redemption and revival to feel that the pain and suffering that first generation immigrants undergo can serve as a catalyst for positive change through the voices and power of the second and further generations of immigrants. The wisdom of learning from our past experience is such an integral part of our individual growth. But we can also extend that learning across generations. How can successive generations learn from the experiences, both good and bad, the triumphs and the missteps of their antecedents, in our journey to create a more thriving and socially just and humane future for everyone? This seems to me an interesting arc to our discussion that is both empowering and hopeful.
Wow, that's beautifully said, Shankar. And we'll even pick this thread back up in the next episode, where we think about change within an individual person over time and change over generations and generations after immigration.
So that's where we'll pause for now, and we'll come back next time to explore the final part of our discussion on this topic, including some forces and global trends related to immigration, like cultural appropriation.
As always, subscribe to our podcast and please leave us a rating on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This really, really helps new people find our show, and we want to thank you all for listening.
See you all next time.